What is generational trauma and what can cause generational trauma?
Mhm. So I would say generational trauma is trauma that has happened with a past generation in someone's family history that has now been transferred onto the present generation or another generation. And the causes could be anything. So the causes could be perhaps abuse, violent, that has impacted somebody negatively, whether that be psychologically or even physically.
So is it very much something that could happen in the home or your parents or families that's
Hmm.
transferred onto the children is a good way to understand
Yes,
generational trauma?
yes, most
And
definitely.
and sometimes I see the impact from ourselves being immigrants in the UK when
Mhm.
our families came over to the UK, whether it was Windrush, and that also can be transferred to the first generation.
Yes, I definitely agree. I definitely feel like the first generations that are born here definitely will find it harder than say the second or third generation. Um, in the fact of the impact of moving from one place to another, especially when it's not that inviting, when one would think that it is. So, like with the Windrush generation, they were invited. So you would think that once they were here, it'd be flowers and roses, because they were wanted here. But that was not the case. And then that transitional period, and then life over here impacting, say, the parents, grandparents, and now how their life has changed, now being passed on to their children, and now say their children passing on to their children, and then it goes down the line with the trauma, and that's how sort of the generational trauma sort of happens.
Absolutely. And that includes the cycle of generation trauma could continue. For example, if we have children, then the second and third generation can go in cycle
Yes,
unless
definitely.
you recognize it or seek treatment for it, it can keep continuing. Would you believe there is hope that generational trauma can stop or be reduced to the next generation?
Yes, for sure. I think maybe not for the next generation, but for generations to come, it could potentially, but it's whether, like we said, the recognition, if you recognize it and do something about it, then that can happen. But then there's also the mix between whether it's generational trauma or whether it's a cultural understanding or a cultural um, aspect of obviously one's heritage, and then the difference between those, and they're not taking away someone's culture from them, but then what is it about that culture that might then also cause trauma for somebody?
Sure, sure. You touched on cultural, which brings me on to my next question. Is racial trauma real? And that could that be intersected with generational trauma?
Hmm. So definitely, racial trauma is definitely real. Whether people want to believe it or not, um, it is. And the mix between generational trauma and racial trauma is definitely real.